All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Socio. I work at SOS in the intrusion detection and prevention team. I spend a lot of my time watching attacks come across to our web servers. A lot of bad logins, things like that. So I'm looking at border traffic all day, and so I've had the experience over the past couple years of really getting to see some successful web attacks and things that go on here at the university. And what we're trying to do is sort of roll some of that experience out to the community and get everybody on board. And so that's what I do. I guess show of hands in the room, Jim, if you can put that poll up. I'd like to kind of know what you guys do. How many of you are like full-time DBAs? And no one. Good, because this. So how many of you are like Unix, Linux sysadmins? There's a few of you. Windows sysadmins, all right. Running Apache, IIS, yeah, the gamut. All right. So what we would like to cover today is I kind of want to go over some of the threat that we see, like what we're seeing at the border and what's actually happening out there, and make you guys aware of that, like why we're pushing some of these measures and some of the things that we're going to talk about. We'd also like to get you guys to understand some of the architectural issues, particularly as it relates to data categorization. How many folks are aware of AD 71? Good enough. So data categorization it's now a policy. Ed in the back of the room is now working on getting a survey out to help people segregate their data, and that is going to impact how we run web services. So the further out in front of that you guys can get, the better. And lastly, we're just going to go over a real basic, simple, it's only an hour-long talk, so there's only so much that we can cover here about hardening. And I'm really only going to cover MySQL and MS SQL. I know we have a lot of folks using Oracle in some places, and I'm sure there's Postgres all over the place too. But the two big ones, because of LAMP and just because of the Microsoft license and the cost involved, we're going to cover those two at a very high level today. So I want to talk a little bit about the surface area we have here at Penn State. We have, on any given day, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 different devices or different IP addresses or different things out there on the network that will answer HTTP. And that's a lot of surface area. I don't know if you guys have been following the news, but there are tons of leaked data from a variety of different ways that web servers can leak data. Recently, Evernote had an issue where it lost user data. The Department of Labor, that's really recent, is struggling with an issue where they're alleging that Chinese hackers put malware on the Department of Labor website in some sort of nuclear. They were looking to get nuclear engineers, basically like at a water cooler. Hey, I know they probably visit this site. If I can infect them, I can then take it back into their environment and get where we need to go. So this is actually a fairly complicated attack. And recently, I forget the name of the community college now, but they recently lost 125,000 of their student Social Security numbers through a web server. So any of the reports that are out now, whether it's the White Hat is out recently, the Verizon report, what are some of the other ones? TrustWave had one out. Basically, any of those reports, say 2012, was absolutely, there was a huge uptick in attacks aimed at web resources. And breaches. So I mean, this is successful ones too. So it's not just that the volume of attacks are up. The volume of successful attacks is up, and hacktivism gets into the news a lot with what LulzSec did, with what Anonymous is up to, whatever cause or political thing they want to do. SEO poisoning. How many know what SEO is? Search engine optimization. So basically, if I am selling carabiners on the internet and somebody searches for carabiner, I want mine up as high as it'll go. Well, the poisoning part comes in is when you're already doing something illegal, like Canadian, masking as a Canadian pharmacy to sell drugs and stuff online. So when somebody searches for Cialis or Viagra or whatever, you want your illegal site to be up as high as it can go. So the way they do that is, if I can get access to a page here and a page there and a page there that then says, hey, look at this legit site for Viagra, my site starts to rise in Bing and Google searches. So we have seen that several times in several different ways here, at Penn State. Botnets. Occasionally you'll see people putting malware out there or trying to spread the botnet with open web servers, but there's really enough hosting places to put malware that they don't care what you're serving. So, but that does happen. Espionage, like I mentioned, with the Department of Labor, we do see a lot of activity coming across the border that is from a lot of Chinese space and other, foreign nations, that it's just they're kind of looking to scrape data. It's not necessarily that what you have or what you have or what you have is explicitly valuable that day, but with a giant pot of data that they can mine, who knows what can come of that. So we do see a lot of this where when a vulnerable server is found, they just dump it. Just scrape all the data out. It's not. I'm not looking for users. I'm not looking for a little bit of ultra valuable information. It's just scrape it all. And this doesn't always happen because of an attack. We're not losing data necessarily because somebody was super sly and broke what we had. We have seen issues where there have been misconfigurations or slip-ups where a file was copied into the wrong place and suddenly your index.php isn't what you think it's supposed to be and is allowing access somewhere. And then there's also been issues with sort of trusting SSL to do more than what it really does. I mean, it's transport layer and that's it. It does not help you with authentication and authorization. And there's times where, again, a misconfiguration there, somebody comes along and changes the permissions, and you're not aware that connects to this other application, and suddenly that's open. That it was locked down tightly before. So, Jim, can you put that poll up? So this diagram basically represents, here's the internet, here's a web server or a couple web servers, and then here's a database or a set of databases. And basically what's represented here is, here's your public site, and here's an internal application with data that you don't want getting out to the internet. So how many folks have a architecture like this, where you have a single server that has multiple types of applications all going back to a single data store? Yeah, so I mean, that's a lot of people do. It's something that we found fairly common when we've gone out to units and talked about these. You have a question, Peggy?
No. I was just thinking about my
Okay. So the issue with this architecture comes up when the public site has a vulnerability. okay? And if somebody's able to start asking the database questions through this public site, cosign and SSL are no longer in play. So, again, our mantra has been lately, it's all about the data. So, how much do you trust the code on your public site? Because that's how much, that's the exposure, the risk exposure that your data is being exposed to there. And some things that we've seen, and the reason we're having this talk is we've seen issues where back at this database server, people are either using the root or the SA account blanket across the database server. And so if I'm able to start asking questions of the database here, as root or SA, I'm able to ask questions of everything here. And that's a big problem. And really, we're kind of going to talk about this here in a second. This is really not a good model of data segregation based on what we're looking at now for 8071 and data categorization. Peggy.
Is the same thing true if you have
So Peggy's asking if we have if the same thing is true if several instances are running on the same server, and I assume this is MS SQL. So depending on how you have that set up and how you have the schemas and the managed service accounts. Did I repeat the question, Jim? Yeah, all right, sorry. So depending on how you have the schemas and the managed service accounts and things like that set up, I think that would be a sufficient segregation.
Unless you have trust built between the instances. Trust, and you can actually jump across instance to instance.
So I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Travis.
Travis has brought up a point here that if you have shared trust set up within that instance of SQL Server, then there is the possibility of jumping between data stores, and that's really what we want to avoid. So what we're currently kind of leaning towards is an architecture that looks a little more like this. And I think maybe 5 years ago this would have looked a lot like an unfunded mandate, but given the cost of Microsoft products on campus, given the VM host, given the fact that almost every unit, college, somewhere has virtual infrastructure available to you, this seems like something that we should be able to get our data, segregated a little bit better, so that our public stuff goes back to a strictly public store, and whether you set that up, within your monolithic SQL server, really tight, or you bring up a whole nother server instances.
So are you referring here
to? So the question is are we talking about sites that don't necessarily share data at all? So
not necessarily, but actually don't share data. Is that?
Yes. So if you have an application here that's dealing with student applicants for some program that you have, all right, and this is your public site where it's your front door and stuff like that, you definitely want to separate out this stuff where you're interacting and collecting data from students from these public services.
Because what we have public can apply for some service, possibly, let's say, student applicant.
Right.
And then what we want to do is we want to provide a higher level of access. Each student can access their own data, but that person can access all of their data. It's the same data.
Mm-hmm.
So we would have that protected by cosign.
Right.
But it is the same data behind it. So that's
Right, and that's all the same application. So what's your name again?
Ned.
Ned. So Ned's bringing up a case where if there's an internal application that students are applying or interfacing with, they can see their own data, but a staff assistant needs to see everything, correct? So, that's something we would look to get here. So the VPN probably would not make sense in this case, because obviously these student applicants aren't going to.
There might actually be a public interface for registration.
Correct.
You can't really protect it behind.
Right, and so in that case, you'd have a public site that may lead back here, but in a one-way. In other words, data can only flow this way. So this is kind of one of the good reasons I'm glad we get people in a room to talk about this, because we obviously don't know every situation that's out there. And as we learn more about, we're doing X, Y, Z, the more that we can know that, the better that we can go out and set up sort of some minimum baselines and give guidance. So this is very generic. This is the concept. And so as and if you have specific issues to say, hey, I'm doing X, Y, Z, there are ways that we can do what you're talking about, with some dual homing and this is out public and any access to the lower level stuff by the staff assistant definitely happens on a VLAN that is protected and things like that.
Both have cosign on it, by the way.
Right.
Our public sites is Silver Stripe and our systems in Cold Fusion. But we've got multiple database servers, but they both sort of cross those database servers.
Correct. So Dave brought up a point about a lot of places are going to be a hybrid of this model. That there are going to be places where, depending on your acceptance and production environments, that this will have to squeeze together a little bit in the back end.
And you want to make sure that you're not using the same access account.
Well, we'll get to that, Peggy. Yeah, Peggy, do you want to? Travis?
And also add in, because I know that you guys the same thing as we did in Upstream with the service analyzer. There is no such thing as select start. It's very, very specific.
Yeah, well,
Everything
all right.
is extremely specific.
Yes, and we're going to get into some of that here. So I'm kind of going to be preaching to the choir. It feels like today, which I make my job easy. Yeah, so ideally in this situation, you're looking at 1918 space back here. Even on the public side, when you're getting into databases, 1918 space is a really good idea. There's really no reason to have your database store publicly available. I know MySQL does, HTTP and various services for remote access. If you guys need that, if that's the way your developers are working and that's what you're used to, there are security ways, to do that where they're coming in on the VPN and then doing their remote desktop or their remote connections. So it's really good to keep this stuff buried anyway. I think we've covered most of that. Travis?
Question. I knew when it first came out, it was a massive security web. There were reporting services because you have to install IIS on the box running Microsoft SQL Server so they can do reporting. Is it still a big vulnerability? I mean, I imagine with this much time they've done something, but I'm not very trusting.
So the question is the reporting service for MySQL, it was a big vulnerability. It required IIS. I don't know that off the top of my head, and we'll get into that. I mean, they do recommend you kind of shut down everything you don't need. So depending on how you're doing your reporting and what you're getting from that, it could be something that, yeah, we don't use it that way, or we get it from another spot. So let's talk about some of this hardening stuff that we're kind of getting into here with what Travis and Peggy want to dig into. Something I think sometimes as admins we forget is that physical security is really important. If this is the keys to the kingdom, you definitely want good locks on the doors. You want access control. You want accountability is the main thing. You can have the best, most technically advanced lock in the world, but if the window at the side of the building can be popped open, it doesn't matter. So accountability is what's key. Who is in the room? What are they doing? The ACES group over in OPP has really got some cool stuff as far as what can protect server rooms and as far as accountability and making sure that you know who's in that room. They're really trying to push towards your ID card is your key to the university, and you just swipe everywhere you go so that you know. So if you guys, I've worked in buildings where I've had the key to the room and the swipe card, but I'd always use the key because that was easier, and that's a no-no. You're going around accountability. So that is the. I'll get off that soapbox. So I'm not going to get too deep into the OS level stuff. I hope you guys. I hope this is boring you to tears. A host-based firewall is a really good idea on your database server. As a matter of fact, I think 2008 and R2, if you install MS SQL and the firewall's not on, it will complain loudly at you, and really restrict that so that you're only accepting connections over the 1433 or 3306 or whatever other services you're running. Make sure it's just those services and that it's just the application host that you're expecting it from. So yeah, patch, update, that goes for the server software, but your application software, it's really critical that your application that hits your database stays up to date. We recently had a lot of cold fusion issues. Probably talked to a handful of people either in the room or out in Adobe land about that, and that was a pretty serious Adobe vulnerability that allowed some pretty low-level access to servers. And then disable, remove unnecessary services. And that's not just the SQL services that you're talking about, like the reporting stuff, but if you don't need IIS running, if you don't need an RDP client running, if you don't need SSH running, don't run them. If you don't, xinetd, God, turn that off. So some of the network stuff, and here's where we're going to kind of get a little specific. So MySQL, if you don't need to do anything on your local LAN, if your web server, if your Apache instance and your MySQL or your IIS and your MySQL instance are on the same box, you don't need networking. So you can either skip that in the my.cnf with just skip-networking under the MySQL-D stanza, or you can do your bind address as 127.0.0.1 and you'll just do it over localhost. But then nothing from the outside will ever contact your SQL server and execute anything successful. And again, if networking is required, so if I have a web server here and a database server here and another web server over here, it'd be great if you could dual home these web servers so that it's 128.118 out this way and it's 192.168 back this way, and the only thing that happens across that 192.168 private space is you guys managing the server and the request from the web server is the only traffic that should be fluttering around on there. And another thing is to speak to your tightening down, when you grant permissions or you create users, really make sure you get this last little section, the @ after the @ sign, right? Don't leave that as asterisk. Don't allow that to come from anywhere. You should know what hosts, if it's going to be coming from 192.168.1.5, it should be in there when you're granting permissions and you're managing users. So MS SQL, as Travis pointed out, there's numerous components. Only enabled the needed components, but they also do the endpoint management. So you can do a TCP/IP connection, you can do named pipes, you can do shared memory. Is that all of them? Whatever, but make sure that only the ones you're going to use are turned on and active. Same thing as before. If it's TCP/IP, use 1918 space. Dual home your stuff and make sure that database is buried where only the application sends SQL commands and only the administrator administrates it. And then the neat thing with MS SQL is that you can do a lot of stuff with the policy-based management that MySQL does in that data description language. So like your creates, drops, it can start to manage a lot of that sort of network level stuff with policy engine, so that you set your policy once and that applies. Whereas with MySQL, you're kind of defining it every granular point where you have something going on, needing to say, oh, my DB host, I need to say these permissions that, and start to use the policy engine. Travis?
Another thing you can do is, since a lot of the server-based technology, you can, in the administrator, you can actually also set policies. So even though this user may have the power to create a table, delete a table, you can actually restrict it down even further, so that if someone does get into the web server, they can't. Like, right. They would have to actually find a way into the SQL server. So
right.
It's a way to put another block.
Right. So Travis is making the point that with certain things like Cold Fusion, you also have another layer of policy engine, and that's places where you really got to think about what your application's doing, how you want it to be done, what the constraints are, and use those two policy engines, effectively. And that's why you guys are employed. It is hard work to do that. So as far as users go in MySQL, each application instance needs to have its own username and password. I think we kind of discussed this to death with the root thing at the beginning. But if you just have, all my web applications are web user, then all of that data can be accessed through every one of those applications. And I can't really think of too many situations where that's really what you want. And they should have strong passwords too. Well, except I don't think with the managed service accounts. Those aren't actually users. Those are a little different in Active Directory. Can you? And then it's just set, and it all handles through Kerberos, and you basically establish the trust. And so with MySQL, definitely do strong usernames and passwords. And again, we said don't use the root user. MySQL, sometimes, depending on who you get your package from, will have anonymous users associated with the test database. This command, if you select asterisk from MySQL.user, where user equals null or nothing, if it returns anything, you definitely don't want that user in your database. So with MS SQL, you definitely want to use the Windows Auth and the managed service accounts. There's also virtual service accounts, but I think they start to get limited when you get into like replication and clustering and certain advanced features. So managed service account is definitely a network account, in the sense of AD, whereas virtual is sort of a local service account. You want to avoid the mixed mode or legacy mode, I think is what they call it, where you can basically do AD and database authorization. And same with that, you want to avoid that if you have the option to manage this user for your application at the Active Directory level.
I totally agree with that, but I got a question. Say that you have a database and then you have like a consulting company that's going to work on one database on your database server. How do you suggest like setting up like a FPS account or something like that? Because FPS, you can still validate it, but it's not running through Active Directory and stuff.
Yeah, so the question is if you have like a contractor or somebody that's going to come in and help you work on a database, yeah, you're kind of getting into the exception range there. And I think that if you guys have that issue, we can kind of come up with ways to do that, whether it's a local Active Directory account or you know, like you said, Friends of Penn State, or something like that. There's no.
Well, we use sponsored accounts.
So you actually pay for an account.
Oh, yeah.
And you're not doing the STAAs. You're actually
No, because
paying the $8 a month or whatever.
45 days is not long enough. We have a bunch
Right.
of contractors.
So Peggy says with her contractors, she buys them sponsored accounts, and yeah, and it's like what, $8 a month,
Yeah.
$10 a month. So, all right, thanks, Peggy. So you know, we've harped on the SA user. It'd be much better from an accountability standpoint to disable, get that SA account out of the way, and have your sysadmins assign the correct sysadmin permissions so that there's accountability when they're doing stuff. You don't want 3 different people logging into SA and then wondering, what just happened? Well, SA did it. You know, just manage it with your admin privilege account. So the principle of least privilege, you know, applies here. I think we kind of get hung up on admin rights sometime, but you really only want to let people execute the commands on the tables that they absolutely need access to. So Jim, you want to throw that other poll up there for me? I don't know if it's going to get in the way here, but this is what we're aiming at. Does this look familiar to anyone? The grant all on MyDB asterisk some user. You know, so I'm building a web application and I need him to do stuff with my web, and I just grant all and start programming away. So yeah, we're about 50-50, but I've done that before, you know, and it's just not good. That's essentially you're creating a root user. This Joe at MyDB host can now create tables, drop tables, you know, can do all sorts of stuff that you probably don't want. And really, if it's a web application, you probably just want grant, you know, select, update, insert, maybe some delete, privileges, and this probably, you know, depending on the database, asterisk is fine. But depending on how you have your application structured and how all that works, you can specify tables too. But that might be getting a little overboard for management. And so if you want to kind of audit what permissions are out there, you know, just show grants for that user and see what they have available. And you can do, you know, select asterisk from MySQL.user, show all your users, and then, you know, start doing the grants for them and say, all right, who has the correct permissions, and sort of audit that. And that's actually probably a good idea to do periodically, especially after updates. You know, a lot of open source software, when they run an update, it'll update things in your tables and put new schemas in place. And if they just so happen to be putting a new user in your database when you run the install script or whatever, you should definitely audit that every once in a while. I mean, we audit our user accounts in Active Directory, or we did when I ran accounts, you know. So it's definitely a good idea to audit places where users have permissions on a regular basis. It's not like you have to do it every week, but, you know, again, after big updates and things like that, think about it. It's a good idea. So MS SQL allows you to do user-defined roles, both at the server level and at the database level. So you can get really granular with this and then start assigning roles to service accounts or users. And this, again, locks it in at that policy level so that you're not running around chasing these things around all the time. So command execution. We've actually seen this happen, and it sucks when it happens, because now if you're able to run this load file or do certain things where you're using SQL to manipulate the file system, that's a rebuild situation. And it stinks to have to rebuild your web server. And we've had to push people down that road. Because we've seen data like this leaving, we've seen them able to, if they're able to upload files, to then be able to manipulate them and get them into places where they can then execute, and that just isn't good. So you can set a variable in the my.cnf file, and it's just this set dash variable equals local in file equals 0, and then you can't run your load file command in MySQL. In MS SQL, the two to watch out for are the XP command shell and spsend dbmail. Generally, if you need to do system level stuff, if you need an application to execute something, there's almost always a better way to do it. Either up at the application layer to say, all right, we'll do the system stuff that we need to do up here, whether it's managing an upload or whatever, or with things like cron or scheduled tasks. There's almost always a better way to do it than having your SQL or transx SQL, whatever, execute a command for you. So encryption. We'll throw this out there with a grain of salt. Encryption brings a lot of management issues. It brings a lot of overhead, and it's not always necessary. If you don't really, we tend not to dig too deep into what's really going on with encryption, and sometimes we just turn it on because it feels safer. And I think, we talked earlier with that, if we go back to those diagrams, yeah, you have SSL out in front of there, but, that's not necessarily protecting your data the way you think it would be. So yeah, apply it wisely. You obviously aren't going to encrypt your whole disk where your database is. It would kill performance. But if you are storing, sensitive pieces of data, it may make sense to encrypt that field. And there's tons of functions and tons of different ways. You can use SHA and MD5 and whatever. You really need to understand what those different functions do if you're going to apply them, because they all have different levels of both security and performance hits. And you guys will have to sort of weigh the needs of the application, appropriately if you're going to start getting into that level of encryption. So with MySQL, their default password hash. So if you use the password 2 parentheses kind of deal, they default to using SHA-1. And I forget how long ago they moved from MD5, but MD5 definitely breaks pretty easily now. And even with the SHA-1, we've seen it where people have done, been able to dump like the user part of the database, and it'll display it out to the website. And I'll actually be able to take that hashed password string and I'll feed it to Google or Bing, and I'll come to a site that basically just does rainbow table cracking, and I'll see the person's password. So it's like, yeah, they have your password. What are the chances that's being used somewhere else? And there's online crack. There's actually places where you can feed in your SHA-1 and MD5 and different types of strings and see if that's a known quantity in some of their rainbow tables, which is why it's good that you get the good long scrambled gobbledygook passwords with the managed accounts. So anyhow, there are options in MySQL to push that up to SHA-256. If you do a create user and say, instead of identified by and then put the password there, which is usually the syntax, you say identified with SHA-256 password. You then have to come back and set the password. It'll do the SHA-256 hashing with that. You can also set that in the my.cnf with default authentication plugin. MySQL also has in the past tried to do certain plugins that get you out to the PAM stack or get you other types of integration with AD or Kerberos, and the most recent version isn't too keen on doing that. They've basically, there's been issues where you're pushing those credentials out in clear text for the first part of that, and that's no good. You know, MS SQL doesn't really have these issues. It integrates cleanly with Active Directory. Everything's just exchanging Kerberos, you know, tokens, and it's all good. So, you know, be careful with where your credentials are floating around. I mean, anytime I did stuff with MS SQL, and it was usually either PHP or Perl or Python, you know, we had it. The username and the password were always clear text in the file anyway that executed the statement, which was kind of scary. So, yeah, and with MySQL, you can force an SSL tunnel. Again, this is where you're getting into management. You're going to grant something to a user and require SSL, and then you got to have where the certificate is and all that stuff. So, you know, if you have your SQL instance buried and you're fairly certain of what's flying across that wire, and you have it locked down pretty well, and you're the only one on the network 99% of the time, except when something horrible happens, you know, is the network really going to be the weakest layer? So that's, you know, again, apply encryption wisely. And that's hard to do, even, you know, as a security professional. Encryption is a tough place to know when and how to apply which algorithm and stuff like that. I'm going to talk about policy management again with MS SQL. Kind of broken record here, but that's where you can enforce transport layer security. You can tell it that the client has to come in over SSL, and you can tell it, depending on which service it is that you're running, that you need the you know, SSL in place. So logging and auditing. Jim, you want to fire that last poll up for me there? So how many people do transactional logging, like binary logging, or keep their transaction logs? Anyone? You do? You do? Yeah, a couple people. So transaction logging is something useful if you're doing replication. So if you have multiple back-end database servers, the transaction logging is critical for that. It's also really good in a restore situation. So if you did your nightly backup at midnight last night, but it just went down 10 minutes ago, that's 16 hours of stuff that happened in your database that you don't know about now. So with transactional logging, you can actually sort of replay that binary file, get a lot of that stuff back from your point of failure, and between your last backup and your point of failure. So it is good for that from a, you know, an availability and recoverability standpoint. And auditing is another thing that kind of comes up. I don't know how many of you do like PCI environments or have 8019 exceptions and stuff like that. If you're doing like Sarbanes-Oxley, and this doesn't really apply too much at Penn State, the auditing features kind of come into play because they really want to know who's logging in, when, and there's features with these engines that allow you to do, you know, hey, that application's logging in like 500 times in the past second. That's outside of normal, so you can sort of set some alerts and get a handle on what's really happening from an auditing standpoint. And for MySQL, that's available through the Enterprise Edition. I've never purchased MySQL Enterprise Edition, so I don't know what all is involved there. But just so you're aware, if you guys do end up needing auditing, you know, compliance or anything like that, you know, there are options there. MS SQL does transaction logging, and again, the enterprise version. And I should have looked up the Microsoft licensing. I assume we get pretty much the whole shebang for the SQL Server. Yeah. So auditing is available there, and it allows really granular control based on what you expect to be happening with your application and how it interacts with your database. So some housekeeping stuff. When you install MySQL, almost every version of that I've seen comes with a test database, and it's largely anonymous access. So you should really get rid of any example or test databases. If you install an application and it puts in some sort of dev database for you to mess around with, get rid of the stuff you don't need, or keep it in an acceptance or development environment that isn't widely available to the internet. Varlib MySQL is where generally on most modern Linux, Unix systems, it could, depending on if you compile, it could be user local varlib MySQL, whatever. But that data store that has the MDB files and that kind of stuff really needs to be locked down. Only the MySQL user and group and root should be doing anything in there. And same with MS SQL. You set your default data directory at your instance. So if it's on the D drive or whatever, make sure wherever you put that is only accessible to your group of sysadmins and the database, the managed service account that you're using. So some handy tools. MySQL comes with a script that does called MySQL Secure Installation. This will actually step you through much of what we just covered here. It'll ask you to set a root password so that that's no longer anonymous. Most of the time when you do a yum install MySQLD or apt-get install SQLD, you get a functioning SQL instance with a root user that has no password. It'll also ask you about, do you want to do networking, on what interfaces, that kind of stuff. So it gets your networking set up. It'll ask you, do you want the test database or should I remove it? And it'll also tell you, hey, we've got these anonymous users, do you want them or no? And knock that stuff out. So that's always a good starting point to at least get your MySQL instance up. And Microsoft makes available for download a SQL Server Best Practice Analyzer, and this basically just takes a look at your database. You point it at the instance that you want it to, and then it basically audits it, and you can. That kind of got all scrambled out. But these are the various services. So you can ask it if you want to do the reporting and the remote and the integration and that kind of stuff. But we just did it for the server engine when we ran it to see what happened. And that's going to be too small to read, isn't it? But basically, it's telling us that our backups are outdated, that our database and our backups exist on the same volume. And that there have been unexpected shutdowns. So they kind of get into not just the things we covered, but a more broader view of what good system management is. And then it starts giving us warnings about our authentication mode, and database consistency check isn't current, and tempdb errors and that kind of stuff. So permissions on the data folder. We just talked about that. So this is a handy tool that, again, just because you run it once doesn't necessarily mean your database is going to stay this way. You got a bunch of different people running, your service. It's a good thing to do, occasionally to make sure that your database is in the state that you want it and expect it to be based on your application. So I'm going to finish up. Do we need to go back? And any other questions? Anything from Connect Land? All right, so the links and such that we have here, so the Guru, it's AD71. MySQL documentation is actually pretty good. And that's dev.mysql. This document, it's actually a Word document that you download. And so if you search for MySQL or Microsoft SQL Server 2012 Security Best Practice White Paper, that's actually a pretty decent document that covers MS SQL in a lot more depth. And this is the link for the Best Practice Analyzer. And it also requires another best practice part at the server level. So it will tell you that you also need to go download, 15 blah 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 something. So you have to download another component to that. But that's the link to the Best Practice Analyzer. And one other thing I thought I'd mention while we're here at this informational stage is that Learning Tree has given several MS SQL classes here, and a couple people in our office have taken them and said they were actually really good. And that I think the most recent one they took was the 2012 update. That the instructor really had the SQL foo down and was able to give them tips and tricks that they probably wouldn't have gotten just from reading a white paper. So, Ed. So Ed mentioned that the Nessus scanner that we offer as a free service also has audit capabilities in this realm. And while we're on that, I don't know if you guys are aware, the Nessus stuff recently went self-service. So if you guys want to be able to run Nessus scans against your network, you don't have to contact us, sit in a queue, wait till we do it, wait till we get you the report. You just get into the console, you run whatever scans you want, you look at the reports. If you have questions, then you contact us and we'll help you. So, and that's pretty awesome. It's actually very awesome. And while I still have you here, upcoming security series. In 2 weeks, John Maddie is going to talk about Microsoft Hyper-V and VDI technology. We can't get enough of him. What he has set up in the president's office is truly awesome. He has a very clean setup where his people get their data through a tiny little pinhole, and every device they go to, it's all virtualized and it's all easy, and I highly recommend this one if you guys are at all interested in virtualization and VDI stuff. He's really got a tight ship running there. All right, last chance. Questions? Anything else? What's that? Jim, how do we do? We can make it available. Yeah, I don't even know why I'm asking questions. Yes, of course it's available. So, yeah, shoot.
Is the self-service Nessus thing released, or is that coming soon? That's live, okay.
Doing it.
Steve asked, how do we get access to the scanner?
Send an email to security. We'll get you set up in the scanner. So if you just send us an email, say, hey, I'm interested in the Nessus self-service program, get access to the console. Damian Futtrick will work with you and get you there. Anything else, Jim? All right, let's sign off. Have a good day, guys. Thanks for coming.